The rain fell in sheets against the weathered planks of Miller's stable as Sarah Daniels huddled her 3 shivering children beneath a thin woolen blanket, praying the storm would drown out their soft whimpers. Colorado Territory, 1871, a harsh place for a widow with no kin and nowhere left to turn. "Hush now," Sarah whispered, stroking her youngest daughter's matted hair. "We're safe here just for tonight." The words felt hollow in her throat. 6 days on the road from Denver, their meager savings depleted, and Animas Forks, this mining settlement nestled high in the San Juan Mountains, had offered nothing but closed doors and suspicious glances. Emma, just 5 years old, curled against her mother's side, her small fingers clutching Sarah's tattered dress. Beside her, 7-year-old Charlotte stared vacantly at the stable wall, too exhausted to cry anymore. James, the oldest at 9, sat rigidly at the edge of their makeshift bed of hay, his father's worn hat pulled low over his eyes, determined to be the man his father could no longer be. The children had finally drifted into uneasy sleep when Sarah heard the stable door creak open. She tensed, instinctively pulling her children closer as heavy footsteps approached their corner. A lantern light cut through the darkness, illuminating the gaunt faces of her sleeping children. "Madam," a deep voice broke the silence. Sarah looked up, squinting against the light to make out the tall figure of a man. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see the surprise in his eyes. "Please," Sarah whispered, "we'll be gone by morning. I just needed shelter for my children tonight." The man lowered his lantern slightly, revealing a weather-worn face with kind eyes that belied the hardness of his jaw. For a long moment he said nothing, simply studying the 4 of them huddled together. "You're home now," he said finally, his voice softer than before. Sarah blinked, certain she had misheard. "Sir, I'm Kieran Xavier," he said, setting the lantern down on a nearby post. "This is my stable and my ranch is just up that hill. I can't have you folks sleeping out here with the horses." He glanced at the sleeping children. "There's a room in my house. It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry." Sarah clutched her blanket tighter. "We can't accept you can, and you will," Kieran interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "There's a storm coming, worse than this one. It's no night for anyone to be out here, especially children." The mention of the children crumbled what little resistance Sarah had left. She nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, gently shaking Emma and Charlotte awake while James was already on his feet, eyeing the stranger warily. "Who are you, mister?" the boy demanded, stepping protectively in front of his mother. Kieran's mouth twitched, almost smiling. "Name's Kieran Xavier." "I own this ranch, and you are James Daniels," the boy replied proudly. "Man of this family." Kieran nodded solemnly. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Daniels. Now, would you help your mother with your sisters? My house isn't far, but that rain's coming down something fierce." Within minutes, Kieran had bundled the youngest girl into his arms while Sarah carried Emma. James insisted on walking alongside them, refusing any assistance as they made their way through the downpour to the modest 2-story house on the hill. Sarah paused at the doorway, rainwater streaming down her face. "Mr. Xavier, I don't know how we can repay you." Kieran shook his head as he ushered them inside. "No need for that now. Let's get these little ones dry." The interior of the house was simple but clean, with a large stone fireplace casting a warm glow across the main room. A pot of stew simmered over the fire, filling the air with a rich aroma that made Sarah's stomach clench painfully. She couldn't remember the last time any of them had eaten a proper meal. "The spare room's upstairs," Kieran said, leading them up a narrow staircase. It was meant for he stopped himself. "Well, it's yours for now." The room contained a large bed and a smaller trundle bed tucked beneath it. "The girls can take the big bed," Kieran suggested. "The trundle pulls out for the boy. There are clean clothes in that trunk that might fit the children. They belong to," again he paused. "They're not being used." Sarah couldn't speak, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness. "I'll bring up some water so you can wash," Kieran continued, filling the silence. "There's stew downstairs when you're ready." After he left, Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. "Mama," Charlotte whispered, "are we staying here?" "Just for tonight, darling," Sarah replied, though she had no idea where they would go tomorrow. She helped the children change into the dry clothes from the trunk's simple but well-made garments that hung loosely on their thin frames before leading them downstairs to the kitchen. Kieran had set the table with 4 bowls of steaming stew and a loaf of bread. He stood awkwardly by the fire, as if unsure of his place in his own home now that it was filled with strangers. "Please join us, Mr. Xavier," Sarah said softly. "It's your home and your food." He nodded, pulling up a chair at the end of the table. As they ate, Sarah noticed how he watched the children, particularly when James devoured his stew with such intensity that he nearly choked. "Easy there," Kieran said. "There's plenty more." After dinner, the exhaustion of the day caught up with the children. Sarah helped them back upstairs, tucking them into the beds that felt impossibly soft after weeks of sleeping rough. They fell asleep almost instantly. Returning downstairs, she found Kieran sitting by the fire, a cup of coffee in his hands. He offered her one, which she accepted gratefully. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found us tonight." Kieran stared into the flames. "What brings you to Anima's Forks, Mrs. Daniels?" "Sarah," she corrected. "And desperation, I suppose." She traced the rim of her cup with her finger. "My husband, Thomas, died 6 months ago, consumption. We had a small farm outside Denver, but the bank took it. I heard there was work in the mining towns." "There is," Kieran nodded, "but not the kind a woman with 3 children should be looking for." Sarah's shoulders slumped. "I'm a good cook. I can sew clean. I'll do whatever work there is." Kieran was quiet for a long moment. "I need help around the ranch," he said finally. "The house, too. My previous housekeeper left when she got married last spring." He looked up at her. "It's honest work. You and your children could stay in that room. There's a small cabin for the ranch hands, but it's empty now. I've been managing alone since my foreman took off for California." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You'd hire me, just like that? You don't know anything about me." "I know you've kept those children alive and together through God knows what," Kieran replied. "That tells me enough about your character." He set down his cup. "Look, it's not charity. I need the help and you need a roof. We can work out fair wages once you see what the job entails." Sarah felt tears threatening again and blinked them back. She wouldn't cry in front of this man who had already shown her more kindness than she'd seen in months. "We'll try it," she said. "For a while at least." Kieran nodded, standing up. "Get some rest, Sarah. Tomorrow will come soon enough." As he turned to leave, Sarah noticed a framed photograph on the mantel, a young woman with a gentle smile. "Is that your wife?" she asked. Kieran glanced at the photograph, his expression unreadable. "Was," he said simply, then bid her good night. Alone by the fire, Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief. They had shelter, the promise of food, and perhaps even a future. It was more than she had dared hope for when they'd crept into that stable as the sun set. The next morning, Sarah woke to the unfamiliar sensation of warmth and comfort. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the sleeping faces of her children. For a moment, she lay still, savoring their peaceful expressions before the reality of their situation returned. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted up from downstairs. Sarah slipped quietly from the bed, dressed in her now dry clothes from yesterday, and made her way to the kitchen. Kieran stood at the stove, looking somewhat out of place as he poked at sizzling bacon with a fork. "Good morning," Sarah said. "Can I help?" Kieran turned, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Please. I can manage coffee, but anything beyond that is questionable at best." Sarah smiled, taking the fork from him. "How long have you been cooking for yourself?" "Too long," he admitted. "I can handle trail food when necessary, but this," he gestured to the stove, "has always been someone else's domain." As Sarah took over the cooking, Kieran set the table. They worked in comfortable silence until the patter of small feet announced the children's arrival. Emma appeared first, her blonde hair a tangled mess around her sleepy face. She stopped in the doorway, suddenly shy in the daylight. "Good morning, little miss," Kieran said, his gruff voice softening. "Hungry?" Emma nodded, edging closer to her mother. Charlotte and James followed, James still maintaining his protective stance despite the hunger evident in his eyes. Over breakfast, Kieran explained the ranch to them. "It's not large, about 200 acres. I run cattle, mostly. Used to have more help, but good men are hard to find these days." He looked at James. "Could use a hand with the horses if you're interested." James straightened, his chest puffing out slightly. "Yes, sir, I can work." "I don't expect children to work for their keep, son," Kieran clarified, "but learning is never a bad thing." After breakfast, Kieran showed Sarah around the house, a practical tour of what would now be her domain. It was larger than it had first appeared, with the main floor containing the kitchen, dining area, sitting room, and Kieran's study. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms and a small washroom. Everything was functionally furnished, but showed signs of neglect. "It's been a while since anyone gave this place proper attention," Kieran admitted as they returned to the kitchen. "I'll understand if you want to look for other arrangements once you've seen what you're dealing with." Sarah surveyed the kitchen, mentally noting what needed to be done. "Mr. Xavier, Kieran, please." "Kieran," she corrected herself. "We slept in your stable last night. This is a palace compared to what we've known recently." His eyes softened. "Well then, I'll leave you to get settled. I need to check the north pasture, but I'll be back by midday." He paused. "There's a vegetable garden out back that's gone wild. Help yourself to anything that's still growing." After Kieran left, Sarah set to work. The kitchen became her first project, and she found a sense of purpose in scrubbing counters and organizing shelves. The children, initially unsure in this new environment, gradually relaxed. James ventured out to explore the stable, while the girls discovered a box of wooden toys in a corner of the sitting room. By midday, Sarah had prepared a simple meal from the supplies in Kieran's pantry. As they ate, she asked the children what they thought of their temporary home. "I like the horses," James said. "Mr. Xavier has 6 of them, and there's a dog, but she's shy." "I found dolls," Emma announced proudly. "Pretty ones." Charlotte, always more perceptive than her years suggested, asked the question Sarah had been avoiding. "How long will we stay, Mama?" Sarah hesitated. "Mr. Xavier has offered me work, darling. We'll stay as long as he needs help." "Is he a good man?" Charlotte pressed. "Papa said not all men are good." Sarah thought of the gentle way Kieran had carried Emma through the rain, how he'd spoken to James as if the boy's opinions mattered. "I think he is," she said carefully, "but we'll be cautious, as always." Kieran returned in the early afternoon, bringing with him the earthy scent of the outdoors. He seemed surprised to find lunch waiting and the kitchen transformed. "You've been busy," he observed, washing his hands at the pump sink. "It helps to have a purpose," Sarah replied. "The pantry needs restocking, though. I can make a list for town." Kieran nodded, sitting down to the meal she'd prepared. "I'll be going in tomorrow. You and the children should come. Get what you need." The prospect of going into town filled Sarah with apprehension. Their last experiences in towns had been unwelcoming at best. "The people here," she began, "are like people everywhere," Kieran finished for her. "Some good, some not, but they know me. That counts for something." That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah found herself on the front porch, wrapped in a shawl against the cooling mountain air. The vast expanse of stars above the San Juans took her breath away. "It never gets old," Kieran's voice came from the shadows. He stepped onto the porch, offering her a cup of tea. "Even after 15 years. You've been here that long." Sarah accepted the cup, grateful for its warmth. "Came after the war," Kieran said, leaning against the porch railing. "Needed space and quiet. This valley provided both." Sarah noticed how he rubbed his left leg absently. "You fought Union cavalry," he nodded. "Got this at Gettysburg." He tapped his leg. "Doesn't trouble me much anymore, except when the weather changes." They stood in silence, sipping tea and watching the night sky. Sarah felt questions forming but held them back. She'd learned that some men spoke of their pasts in their own time, if at all. "Your children," Kieran said finally. "They seem resilient." "They've had to be," Sarah replied. "James especially. He thinks he needs to be the man now. That's a heavy burden for young shoulders." "Too heavy," Sarah agreed. "But he won't let me lift it from him." Kieran nodded in understanding. "Sometimes the only way forward is to carry what you must." The next day brought their first trip into Anima's Forks. Sarah dressed the children in the cleanest clothes from the trunk, braided the girls' hair, and made sure James's face was scrubbed clean. The town was smaller than she'd expected, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a single dirt road, with the imposing structures of the mining operations looming on the hillside above. As Kieran drove the wagon down the main street, Sarah felt eyes turning toward them. "Morning, Xavier," called a bearded man from the doorway of the general store. "Sheriff," Kieran nodded. "Good day for business." "Can't complain," the sheriff replied, his gaze shifting curiously to Sarah and the children. Kieran made no introductions, simply helping Sarah down from the wagon before lifting the girls. "General store first," he said quietly. "Doyle's a fair man. Won't overcharge you." Inside the store, Sarah carefully selected necessities while Kieran spoke with the proprietor. The children stayed close, sensing their mother's tension. When a well-dressed woman entered and stared openly at them, Charlotte pressed against Sarah's skirts. "Xavier," the woman acknowledged coolly. "I didn't know you had visitors." "Mrs. Thornton," Kieran replied with a stiff nod. "Mrs. Daniels is my new housekeeper." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "Indeed. How providential for her." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks but kept her expression neutral as she continued selecting items. When they left the store, Kieran's jaw was set in a hard line. "Don't mind Abigail Thornton," he said as he loaded their purchases into the wagon. "She considers herself the moral authority of Anima's Forks." "She seemed to have opinions about me being at your ranch," Sarah observed quietly. Kieran sighed. "Small towns run on gossip, Sarah. People will talk." "It doesn't matter." But they both knew it did matter. A single woman living under the roof of a bachelor, regardless of her position or the presence of children, would inevitably raise eyebrows. Their next stop was the doctor's office, which surprised Sarah. "The children seem healthy," she said uncertainly. "Precaution," Kieran replied. "Dr. Simmons is a good man. He should have a look at them after your travels, Doctor." Simmons proved to be a kindly older gentleman who examined each child thoroughly, pronouncing them undernourished but otherwise sound. He gave Sarah a tonic for them and refused payment when Kieran offered it. "Consider it a welcome to Anima's Forks," he said, patting Emma's head. "I've been trying to get Xavier to bring some life into that big house of his for years." By the time they returned to the ranch, Sarah was exhausted from the tension of navigating the town's curious stares. The children, however, seemed energized by the adventure. "Can I help with the horses now, Mr. Xavier?" James asked as soon as they arrived. Kieran exchanged a glance with Sarah, who nodded her permission. "Come along then," he said to the boy. "First lesson is how to properly unsaddle and brush down after a ride." As the days passed, they settled into a rhythm. Sarah took charge of the house, bringing order to rooms that had clearly been neglected. The girls helped in small ways, sorting laundry or shelling peas from the garden. James spent every possible moment with Kieran, absorbing lessons about horses, cattle, and ranch life with solemn attention. Sarah observed with quiet gratitude how Kieran was patient with her son, never dismissing his questions or belittling his attempts to help. James began to smile more, his shoulders gradually losing their rigid set. 2 weeks after their arrival, Sarah found Kieran in his study late one evening, poring over ledgers with a troubled expression. "Is something wrong?" she asked, setting down a cup of coffee beside him. Kieran looked up, momentarily startled by her presence. "Just figures that won't balance," he said, closing the book. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Sarah had caught a glimpse of the columns. "The ranch is struggling," she stated rather than asked. Kieran sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "The railroad coming through last year changed things. Cattle prices aren't what they were. I've been considering options." "Is that why you're managing alone, to save on wages?" he nodded. "Jenkins, my foreman, left because I couldn't pay him what he was worth anymore. Can't blame him for that." Sarah sat in the chair across from him. "If you can't afford to keep us—" "No," Kieran interrupted firmly. "That's not it. Your wages are fair for the work, and you've transformed this place in just 2 weeks." He gestured to the now orderly study. "The issue is larger. I may need to sell some land or diversify somehow." Sarah considered this. "My father raised horses before he took up farming. Special ones for carriage teams in New York. He said there was always money in quality stock. Breeding horses is a long game," Kieran mused. "Takes time to build a reputation." "But you have the land and the knowledge," Sarah pointed out. "And from what I've seen, your stallion is exceptional." Kieran looked at her with newfound respect. "You know horses." "Enough," she smiled. "I wasn't always just a farmer's wife." Their conversation shifted to possibilities, breeding plans, potential markets, the pros and cons of various approaches. By the time they parted for the night, Sarah realized they'd talked as equals, as partners in a shared challenge. The thought lingered pleasantly as she drifted to sleep. The following Sunday, Kieran suggested they attend church in town. "It's expected," he explained, "and it might help with perceptions." Sarah understood the unspoken concern. Mrs. Thornton's cold stare in the general store had been just the beginning. If they were to stay in Anima's Forks, they needed to establish themselves as respectable. The small church was filled when they arrived, and Sarah felt the collective gaze of the congregation as Kieran led them to a pew near the back. The children, dressed in their best clothes from the trunk, sat quietly between them. After the service, Kieran introduced Sarah formally to several people, including the minister and his wife. She maintained a polite smile despite the barely disguised curiosity in their eyes. "So you're helping poor Xavier with that big house of his," said one older woman, patting Sarah's hand. "Such a blessing for both of you, I'm sure." "Indeed," Sarah replied carefully. "My children and I are very grateful for Mr. Xavier's kindness." As they prepared to leave, Abigail Thornton approached with a tall, stern-faced man. "Xavier," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I don't believe Mrs. Daniels has met my husband, Judge Thornton." The judge gave Sarah a curt nod. "Madam, Quite a fortunate arrangement you found yourself in." "The fortune is mine, Judge," Kieran interjected smoothly. "Mrs. Daniels has brought order to chaos." Judge Thornton's gaze lingered on Sarah. "I'm sure she has, though some might say appearances matter as much as reality." Sarah felt her chest tighten at the implication, but before she could respond, Emma tugged at her skirt. "Mama, can we see the puppies?" she asked, pointing to where some children were gathered around a litter of puppies near the church steps. "Of course, darling," Sarah smiled, grateful for the interruption. "Excuse us, please." As they walked away, Sarah heard Abigail's stage whisper, "3 fatherless children living under a bachelor's roof. It simply isn't proper." Kieran's reply was too low to hear, but the set of his jaw told Sarah he was angry. The ride home was quiet, with Kieran lost in thought and the children subdued by the tension. That evening, after the children were asleep, Kieran found Sarah on the porch again, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "I didn't consider how your position here might be viewed." Sarah turned to face him. "You offered honest work when no one else would. You have nothing to apologize for." "Nevertheless," Kieran insisted, "the Thorntons and their ilk can make life difficult. If you'd prefer to find a position in town—" "Is that what you want?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Kieran stepped closer. "No," he said firmly, "that's not what I want at all." The air between them seemed to thicken. Sarah was acutely aware of his presence, of the scent of leather and pine that always surrounded him, of how his eyes reflected the golden light from the house. "What do you want, Kieran?" she whispered. He reached out slowly, his calloused fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Peace," he said. "For a long time that's all I thought I wanted. Now I'm not so sure." Sarah felt something flutter in her chest, a sensation she'd thought long buried with Thomas. Before she could respond, a cry came from inside the house. Emma's voice, high with the terror of a nightmare. "I should go to her," Sarah said, stepping back. Kieran nodded. "Of course." By the time Sarah had soothed Emma back to sleep, the moment on the porch seemed like a dream. Yet something had shifted between them, a door opened that could not easily be closed again. The next morning brought heavy gray clouds and the promise of early snow. Kieran announced he needed to move cattle from the high pasture before the weather turned. James immediately volunteered to help. "It'll be a long, cold day," Kieran warned. "Not much fun." "I can do it," James insisted. "I'm strong enough." Kieran looked to Sarah, who hesitated before nodding. "Be careful," she told her son, "and mind Mr. Xavier's instructions." As they rode out, Sarah couldn't help worrying. James was still so small to be out in such weather, doing a man's work. Yet she saw how straight he sat in the saddle of the gentle mare Kieran had chosen for him, his father's hat pulled low against the wind. The day stretched endlessly, as Sarah kept busy with household tasks, frequently glancing out the window as the clouds darkened. By mid-afternoon, snow began to fall tentatively at first, then with growing intensity. When the kitchen clock struck 5 with no sign of Kieran and James, Sarah began to pace. "Where's Jamie?" Charlotte asked, looking up from the doll she was dressing. "Still working with Mr. Xavier," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "They'll be home soon." But 6 o'clock came, then 7, and the snow continued to fall. Sarah had just decided to saddle a horse and go looking for them when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. She rushed to the door to find Kieran dismounting with James cradled in his arms. "He's all right," Kieran said quickly, seeing the terror in her eyes. "Just cold and tired. The north fence broke in the wind and we had to chase down strays. He never complained once." James stirred as Sarah reached for him. "I helped, Mama," he murmured. "Mr. Xavier said I was brave." "You were," Kieran confirmed, carrying the boy inside and setting him gently before the fire. As brave as any man I've ridden with. Sarah knelt beside her son, checking him for injuries while Kieran fetched blankets. James's hands were red with cold but not frostbitten. His clothes were sodden, his teeth chattering despite his attempts to appear strong. Into a hot bath with you, Sarah decided. Then straight to bed. Later, after James was warm and sleeping soundly, Sarah found Kieran in the kitchen, his own clothes changed but his hair still damp from the snow. "Thank you for bringing him home safely," she said, pouring him a cup of hot coffee. "He's a fine boy, Sarah," Kieran replied. "Tough as they come." "Reminds me a little of," he stopped, looking down at his cup. "Of who?" Sarah asked gently. Kieran was quiet for a long moment. "I had a son," he said finally, "and a wife. Elizabeth, the photograph you saw." Sarah sat across from him, saying nothing, giving him space to continue if he chose. "They died in '66, he said. "Fever took them both within a week of each other. Daniel was 8. His voice was flat, as if the emotion had been worn away by years of carrying the grief. "That's why I have the extra room, the toys. They were his." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm so sorry, Kieran." His fingers tightened around hers. "For a long time after, I couldn't see the point of anything, just kept the ranch going because it was what I knew how to do." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Then I found 4 strangers sleeping in my stable, and suddenly there was noise and life in my house again." Sarah felt tears prickling behind her eyes. "We've disrupted your peace." "In the best possible way," Kieran said, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "I didn't realize how silent it had become until your children filled it with sound again." They sat that way for a long time, hands joined across the table, neither quite ready to acknowledge what was growing between them. As October gave way to November, life at the ranch settled into a deeper rhythm. The first snow hadn't lasted, melting away to reveal ground still unprepared for winter. Kieran worked from dawn to dusk, preparing for the coming cold, with James as his constant shadow. The boy grew stronger, his face losing its pinched, worried look as he learned the ways of the ranch. Sarah expanded her domain beyond the house, taking charge of the neglected garden and the small flock of chickens that had been barely producing. She began putting up preserves for winter, filling the root cellar with jars of vegetables from the garden and wild berries the girls had helped gather. The girls, too, found their places. Charlotte revealed a talent for numbers, helping Sarah keep track of household supplies and even assisting Kieran with simple ranch accounts. Emma, still so young, brought laughter back into a house that had known too little of it. Sarah was kneading bread dough one crisp morning when Kieran appeared at the kitchen door, his expression troubled. "Sheriff's in the yard," he said quietly. "Wants to speak with you." Sarah's hands stilled, fear immediately flooding her veins. "Did he say why?" Kieran shook his head. "Just that it's official business." Sheriff Doyle removed his hat as Sarah stepped onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Daniels," he said with a nod. "Sorry to disturb your morning." "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" Sarah asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Got a telegram from Denver," he said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "Seems someone's been looking for a woman and 3 children matching your description. Man named Hollister. Says he's your brother-in-law." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Kieran stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. "George Hollister is indeed my late husband's brother," Sarah confirmed carefully. "But we are not close." Sheriff Doyle studied her face. "He claims you've taken property belonging to him. Says he was appointed guardian of the children after your husband's death." "That's a lie," Sarah said, her voice sharper than intended. Thomas left everything to me and the children. George contested the will, but the judge ruled in our favor. Then why are you running?" The sheriff asked bluntly. Sarah glanced at Kieran, then back to the sheriff. "Because George burned our farm to the ground when he couldn't get it legally," she said quietly. "We barely escaped with our lives." Kieran's intake of breath was audible. The sheriff's eyes widened slightly. "I have no proof," Sarah continued. "It was night. The children and I were sleeping. By the time we got out, the house was engulfed. George arrived the next morning, all sympathy and offers of help if I'd sign over Thomas's land claim in the mountains. When I refused, he threatened to have the children taken away." "What land claim?" Kieran asked. "Thomas staked a claim in the San Juans years ago, before we were married," Sarah explained. "He always believed there was silver there. George thought so too, apparently." Sheriff Doyle folded the telegram slowly. "This is a serious accusation, Mrs. Daniels." "I'm aware," Sarah replied. "I have the deed to the claim in my possession. It's all we have left of Thomas's estate. It's worthless unless there really is silver there, but it's legally ours, mine and the children's." The sheriff considered this. "Hollister says he's coming to Anima's Forks to collect what's his." "The children are not his," Sarah said firmly, fear giving way to anger. "Nor is the claim." "Well," Sheriff Doyle said, replacing his hat, "I can't stop a man from traveling where he pleases, but I can keep an eye out for trouble when he arrives." He glanced at Kieran. "Might want to be prepared for visitors, Xavier." After the sheriff rode away, Sarah sank onto the porch step, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "I should have told you," she said without looking at Kieran. "About George, about why we were really traveling." Kieran sat beside her. "Would you tell me now?" Sarah took a deep breath and began the story from the beginning: Thomas's illness, his death, the discovery that his mining claim might actually contain silver, George's increasingly threatening behavior, and finally, the night of the fire that had forced them to flee Denver with little more than the clothes on their backs and Thomas's precious deed. "We traveled west because I knew the claim was somewhere in the San Juans," she explained. "I thought perhaps I could sell it to someone who could develop it properly. The children and I just needed enough to start over somewhere George couldn't find us." "And now he's coming here," Kieran said grimly. Sarah nodded, twisting her hands in her apron. "We should leave. I won't bring trouble to your door after all you've done for us." "No," Kieran said firmly. "This is your home now, remember. We'll face Hollister together." The word home caught in Sarah's chest, warming her despite her fear. "Kieran, he's dangerous. If he burned our farm, then he'll find this ranch a harder target," Kieran interrupted. "I didn't survive Gettysburg to be intimidated by a land-grabbing bully." He placed his hand over hers, stilling her nervous movements. "Where exactly is this claim of yours?" Sarah described the location as best she could from Thomas's descriptions. Kieran's eyes widened. "That's just over the ridge from the north pasture," he said. "On my land, or what used to be before I sold that section last spring." "Sold it? To whom?" "Mining consortium from Chicago," Kieran replied. "They started preliminary work in the summer, but I haven't heard much since then." Sarah stared at him, her mind racing. "If they found silver, then your claim could be worth a great deal," Kieran finished. "Enough to make a desperate man do desperate things." The thought hung between them as the implication settled. If George was coming all the way to Anima's Forks, he must believe the claim was valuable. And if he was willing to burn a farm with a family inside, what else might he do? The days that followed were tense. Kieran insisted the children stay close to the house, and he began carrying his revolver again, something Sarah noticed but didn't comment on. She kept Thomas's deed with her at all times, secured in a small pouch beneath her dress. A week passed with no sign of George Hollister. Then, too, the waiting became its own kind of torment. "Perhaps he won't come," Sarah suggested one evening as she and Kieran sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. The children were inside, Emma already asleep while James and Charlotte played checkers by the fire. "Perhaps," Kieran agreed, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Or perhaps the snow in the passes has delayed him." The first major snowfall of the season had blanketed the high country 2 days earlier, making travel difficult. The ranch was prepared. Kieran and James had worked tirelessly to ensure the cattle had shelter and feed, and the house was stocked with supplies that would last through spring if necessary. "I never thanked you properly," Sarah said after a comfortable silence, "for all of this." She gestured to encompass the ranch, the house, their life together. Kieran turned to look at her, his face softened by the fading light. "You've thanked me every day, Sarah, with your work, your care for this place, with the way you've brought it back to life." "It wasn't just the place that needed life," Sarah said quietly, meeting his gaze. Something shifted in Kieran's eyes, a decision made, a barrier falling. He reached for her hand, enfolding it in both of his. "Sarah," the sound of approaching horses cut him off. Both of them stood, peering into the gathering dusk. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, heading directly for the ranch house. "Inside," Kieran said urgently. "Lock the door and keep the children quiet." Sarah obeyed, her heart pounding as she hurried into the house. James looked up from the checkerboard, instantly alert to her distress. "What's wrong, Mama?" he asked. "Nothing to worry about," Sarah assured him, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. "Just some late visitors. I need you to take Charlotte upstairs and stay there until I call you." James hesitated, clearly wanting to argue, but the seriousness in Sarah's expression convinced him. He took his sister's hand and led her upstairs, glancing back once with worried eyes. Through the window, Sarah watched as Kieran stood his ground on the porch, one hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. The riders stopped in the yard, and even in the dim light, Sarah immediately recognized the stocky figure in the lead, George Hollister. "Evening," she heard Kieran call. "You're a long way from anywhere this time of night." "Looking for my sister-in-law," George replied, his voice carrying the same oily confidence Sarah remembered. "Sheriff says she's staying here." "And who might you be?" "George Hollister." "Her dead husband's brother and legal guardian of her children." Kieran shifted slightly, blocking the door more fully. "That's so. Funny, she tells a different story." George dismounted, his 2 companions following suit. They were rough-looking men, the kind hired for muscle rather than conversation. "Women get confused about legal matters," George said dismissively. "Now, if you'll just fetch Sarah and the children, we'll be on our way. Mrs. Daniels isn't going anywhere she doesn't want to go," Kieran replied, his tone hardening. "And neither are her children." George's face darkened. "This isn't your concern, mister. This is family business." "When it happens on my property, it's my concern," Kieran countered. "And Mrs. Daniels and her children are under my protection." Sarah couldn't stand it any longer. Despite Kieran's instructions, she opened the door and stepped onto the porch beside him. "Hello, George," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You've come a long way for nothing." George's face twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah, my dear, you've led us on quite a chase. The children inside, safe from you," Sarah replied. "As they'll remain." George's smile faltered. "Now, Sarah, don't be difficult. You know the court appointed me their guardian." "No court did any such thing," Sarah said firmly. "Just as no court gave you Thomas's claim, the one you're really here for." A flicker of something, rage, perhaps, or simple greed crossed George's face before he masked it with concern. I'm simply looking out for my brother's children. Denver is no place for a woman alone, especially after that terrible fire. Such a tragedy. Yes, Sarah agreed coldly, particularly since it was deliberately set. The two men with George shifted uncomfortably. One muttered something to the other that Sarah couldn't hear. "Careful with your accusations," George warned, his pretense of concern evaporating. "I have legal rights here. That claim belongs to the Hollister family, to Thomas Hollister and his heirs," Sarah interrupted. "Not to you, George." George stepped forward, his face flushing with anger. "You stubborn bitch. You have no idea what that claim is worth now. The Chicago Mining Company has struck the richest silver vein in Colorado just a mile from Thomas's stake. They've offered a fortune for adjoining claims." Kieran's hand moved to Sarah's back, a silent gesture of support. "So that's what this is about," he said. "Money. It's about what's rightfully mine," George snapped. "My father staked the original claims in these mountains. Thomas was just following his map. That silver belongs to me as much as him." "The deed says otherwise," Sarah replied. "And it's held in trust for the children until they come of age." George's eyes narrowed. "Give me the deed, Sarah, tonight, or I swear you'll regret it." "Is that a threat, Mr. Hollister?" Kieran asked quietly, his hand now resting openly on his revolver. "It's a promise," George replied, glancing meaningfully at his companions. "Your ranch is isolated. Accidents happen." "Like fires?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking with renewed anger. "You tried to burn us alive in Denver, George. Did you really think we wouldn't know it was you?" One of George's men took a step backward, looking uneasily at his employer. "You didn't say nothing about no fire with kids inside, Hollister." George shot him a venomous glare. "Shut your mouth, Davis." But the damage was done. The second man was also looking at George with new wariness. "I'm not getting hanged for killing women and children," he muttered. "Not for any amount of silver." "Nobody's killing anyone," George hissed. "We're simply collecting what's mine." "Sounds to me like your friends have more conscience than you do, Hollister," Kieran observed. "And now I think it's time you left my property. The sheriff knows you're here, by the way. Expecting trouble." George's face contorted with rage. For a moment, Sarah thought he might lunge at them, but then he seemed to recalculate, forcing his features into a cold smile. "This isn't over," he said. "Not by a long shot." He turned to his men. "Mount up." The hired guns seemed relieved to comply, quickly returning to their horses. George followed more slowly, his eyes never leaving Sarah. "I'll be in town," he said as he mounted. "When you're ready to be reasonable, you know where to find me." They watched as the three riders disappeared into the darkness. Only when they were out of sight did Sarah realize she was trembling violently. Kieran's arm went around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. "You were very brave," he said softly. "I was terrified," Sarah admitted. "I still am. He won't give up, Kieran, not now that he knows how valuable the claim might be." "No," Kieran agreed, "but neither will we." Inside, they found James sitting on the stairs, clearly having heard at least part of the confrontation. His face was pale but determined. "Was that the bad man who burned our house?" he asked. Sarah sighed, kneeling before her son. "You should have stayed upstairs, James." "I'm the man of the family," he insisted. "I needed to know." Sarah's heart broke a little at his words. No child should feel such responsibility. "Yes," she said gently, "that was your Uncle George, but he's gone now." "He'll come back," James said with certainty. "Men like that always do." "That's what Papa said." Kieran crouched beside Sarah. "Your Papa was right," he told James seriously. "But when bad men come back, good men are ready for them. And there are more good men than bad in this world, son. Remember that." James studied Kieran's face, then nodded solemnly. "Will you teach me to shoot, Mr. Xavier?" "James?" Sarah protested. "Not today," Kieran answered, ignoring Sarah's objection. "But someday when you're ready. For now, the best thing you can do to protect your family is to be smart and listen to your mother. Can you do that?" James considered this, then nodded again. "Yes, sir." "Good man," Kieran said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Now, I believe we have a checkers game to finish before bed." Later, after the children were asleep, Sarah and Kieran sat at the kitchen table, planning their next move. The deed lay between them, its worn edges testimony to how tightly Sarah had clutched it during their flight from Denver. "We should talk to the sheriff in the morning," Kieran suggested. "Make a formal complaint against Hollister for the threats." "He'll deny it," Sarah sighed. "And his men won't testify against him, not if they want to be paid." "Maybe, maybe not," Kieran said. "That one man seemed genuinely disturbed about the fire, if we can get him alone." Sarah shook her head. "Even if the sheriff believes us, he can't watch us every minute. And George won't give up, not with so much at stake." "Then we need to resolve this another way," Kieran decided. "What if we approached the Chicago Mining Company directly? With a legitimate deed, they might prefer to deal with you than with Hollister." Sarah considered this. "It's possible. But George has connections in Denver. He might have already spoken with them." "It's worth trying," Kieran insisted. "I know the company representative who bought my land. He seemed an honest sort. I could ride to their office in the morning." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. Most men would have sent us on our way once they knew we brought trouble." Kieran turned his hand to clasp hers. "I'm not most men," he said simply. "And you're not most women." His eyes held hers, the intensity in them making her breath catch. "I meant what I said earlier, Sarah. This is your home now, yours and the children's. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe here." "Why?" Sarah whispered, though part of her already knew the answer, had known it for weeks, perhaps even from that first night in the stable. Kieran stood, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. "Because in one stormy night, you brought life back into my world," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Because your children's laughter healed something in me I thought was broken forever." He reached up to touch her face, his fingers gentle against her cheek. "Because I love you, Sarah Daniels. God help me, I love you." Sarah felt tears spill onto her cheeks as years of grief and fear gave way to something warm and alive and hopeful. "I love you too," she whispered. "So much it frightens me." "Don't be afraid," Kieran murmured, drawing her closer. "Not of this. Not of us." When his lips met hers, Sarah felt as if she were coming home in a way she never had before, not to a place, but to a person. To the man who had found her and her children in their darkest moment and offered not just shelter, but a future. Morning brought clear skies and fresh resolve. Over breakfast, Kieran outlined his plan to ride to the mining company's office near the main diggings, 12 miles away. Sarah would take the children into town to speak with Sheriff Doyle, ensuring there would be witnesses if George tried anything. "Stay in public places," Kieran instructed as he prepared to leave. "The general store, the church if necessary. Don't go anywhere alone." "We'll be careful," Sarah promised. "You too." Kieran kissed her briefly, mindful of the children watching with wide eyes. "I'll be back before sunset," he said, then knelt to address James directly. "You're the man of the house until I return. Take care of your mother and sisters." James nodded, standing straighter. "Yes, sir." The trip to town was tense but uneventful. Sheriff Doyle listened to Sarah's account of the previous night's confrontation with genuine concern. "Hollister's staying at the hotel," he confirmed. "Came in last night with those two fellows, looking like thunder. They left this morning, though heading back to Denver, they said." "And George?" Sarah asked. "Still here," the sheriff replied. "Says he's got business in town." He studied Sarah's face. You really think he'd hurt the children to get that claim? Sarah thought of the fire, of waking to choking smoke and the terrified screams of her children. I know he would, she said quietly. He already tried. Sheriff Doyle sighed heavily. I'll keep an eye on him while he's in my town. That's all I can promise. Thank you, Sheriff, Sarah said. That's all I ask. The rest of the day stretched endlessly as Sarah and the children moved between the general store, where Mrs. Doyle kindly allowed them to sit by the stove, and the small lending library attached to the schoolhouse. James grew increasingly restless, while Emma became clingy, sensing her mother's anxiety. By mid-afternoon, with no sign of George and no word from Kieran, Sarah decided to visit Dr. Simmons to ask about the children's tonic. The doctor's office was on the main street in full view of the sheriff's office. It seemed safe enough. Dr. Simmons welcomed them warmly, insisting on checking each child's progress since their first visit. They're looking much healthier, he told Sarah, especially the boy. Getting some good mountain air and proper food, I see. Mr. Xavier takes good care of us, Charlotte volunteered, her natural shyness overcome by her fondness for the gentle doctor. I'm sure he does, Dr. Simmons replied with a knowing smile that made Sarah blush. Xavier's a good man. Been alone too long. As they prepared to leave, the doctor held Sarah back a moment. Mrs. Daniels, he said quietly, I heard about your brother-in-law being in town. If you need a safe place for the children, my wife and I have plenty of room. Sarah was touched by the offer. Thank you, doctor. But I hope it won't come to that. Outside, the early winter dusk was already settling over Anima's Forks. Sarah gathered the children close, intending to return to the general store to wait for Kieran. As they turned the corner, however, George Hollister stepped out from between two buildings, blocking their path. Sarah, he greeted her, as if they were meeting by chance. I was hoping to run into you. Sarah pushed the children behind her. We have nothing to discuss, George. On the contrary, he replied smoothly, we have a business proposition to discuss, one that could benefit us both. I'm not interested in any proposition from you. George's smile tightened. You haven't heard it yet. The Chicago Mining Company has made an offer for Thomas's claim. A very generous one. He reached into his coat and produced an official-looking document. I've taken the liberty of drawing up the paperwork. You sign over the claim to me, and I'll give you 20% of the proceeds, more than enough for you and the children to live comfortably. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. After everything you've done, you expect me to trust you with the children's inheritance. Be reasonable, Sarah, George urged. You're a woman alone. You can't develop a mining claim. You need a man's guidance. She's not alone, James piped up from behind Sarah, his voice remarkably steady for a 9-year-old facing down his uncle. She has Mr. Xavier. George's expression darkened. Ah, yes, your convenient protector. I've been asking around town about him. Seems he's in financial trouble. His ranch is mortgaged to the hilt. Did he tell you that? When Sarah didn't respond, George pressed his advantage. He's using you, Sarah. He sees a widow with a valuable claim and thinks he can get his hands on it by playing the hero. You're wrong, Sarah said firmly, though the revelation about Kieran's finances sent a cold tendril of doubt through her mind. He had mentioned struggling, but not that the ranch was mortgaged. Am I? George challenged. Ask yourself why a man like Xavier would take in a destitute widow and 3 children if there wasn't something in it for him. Men like that don't do charity. Mr. Xavier is kind, Emma said suddenly, her small face indignant. He reads me stories and made me a swing. You're mean. George's face flushed with anger. Children should be seen and not heard, he snapped. Something you'd know if you'd been raised properly. That's enough, Sarah interrupted. We're leaving now. If you want to discuss the claim, you can do it through a lawyer. She started to move past him, but George grabbed her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. "You're not going anywhere until we settle this," he growled, all pretense of civility gone. "Let go of my mother," James demanded, launching himself at George's legs. George shoved the boy away, sending him sprawling onto the muddy street. Charlotte screamed. Emma began to cry. Sarah fought against George's grip, her fear for her children overriding everything else. "What's going on here?" a deep voice called out. Sheriff Doyle was hurrying down the street, drawn by the commotion. Behind him, Sarah saw Dr. Simmons emerging from his office. George immediately released her, his manner changing in an instant. "Just a family disagreement, Sheriff," he said smoothly. "My sister-in-law has a temper." "That's not what it looked like to me," Dr. Simmons countered, helping James to his feet and checking him for injuries. "Looked like assault on a woman and child." Sheriff Doyle's gaze moved from George to Sarah. "Mrs. Daniels, you want to press charges?" Before Sarah could answer, the thunder of approaching hooves drew everyone's attention. Kieran rode into town at a gallop, reining in sharply when he spotted the gathering outside the doctor's office. His face was grim as he dismounted, moving immediately to Sarah's side. "Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes scanning her and the children for signs of harm. When he saw the mud on James's clothes and the redness on Sarah's arm where George had grabbed her, his expression hardened. "What did you do?" he demanded of George. "Stay out of this, Xavier," George warned. "This is between me and my family." "They're not your family," Kieran replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "Not anymore." Sheriff Doyle stepped between the two men. "That's enough, both of you. No fighting in my streets." He turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Daniels, do you want to file a complaint?" Sarah looked at George, at the hatred barely concealed in his eyes, and knew that legal proceedings would only prolong their ordeal. "No," she said finally. "I just want this to end." Kieran's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "It can," he told her. "Today." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope, which he handed to Sarah. The Chicago Mining Company was very interested to learn that the legal owner of the Hollister claim was in Animas Forks, he said, watching George's face as he spoke. "Their lawyer drew this up immediately." Sarah opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a contract offering to purchase Thomas's claim for an amount that made her gasp. "This is a fair price," Kieran finished for her. "Far more than Hollister here offered, I'm guessing. And it goes directly to a trust for the children with you as trustee." George lunged forward, trying to snatch the paper from Sarah's hands. "Let me see that," he snarled. Sheriff Doyle caught his arm. "Easy now, Hollister. The lady has business to conduct." "You can't do this," George hissed at Sarah. "That claim is legally mine as trustee for Thomas's children," Sarah cut him off. "The mining company's lawyer confirmed it." She turned to Sheriff Doyle. "I'd like to sign this contract in your presence, Sheriff, as a witness, and Dr. Simmons as well, if he's willing." "Of course," Dr. Simmons agreed immediately. "This is robbery," George protested, his face mottled with rage. "I'll contest it in court." "You're welcome to try," Kieran replied calmly, "but the mining company has a very thorough legal department, and they've agreed to handle any challenges to the title as part of the purchase." George's eyes darted between them, calculating. Finally, he spat on the ground at Sarah's feet. "You haven't seen the last of me," he threatened. "Actually, I believe we have," Kieran countered. The company's lawyer also suggested that any further harassment of Mrs. Daniels or her children might result in an investigation into the Denver fire. They seemed to have connections with the territorial governor. Sarah watched as the implications of this sank in. George's face went from red to pale in an instant. Without another word, he turned and stalked away, his back rigid with thwarted rage. In Sheriff Doyle's office, Sarah signed the contract with steady hands, officially transferring Thomas's claim to the Chicago Mining Company in exchange for a sum that would ensure her children's security for life. When it was done, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders, not just the burden of the claim, but the fear that had driven them from Denver. "It's over," Kieran said as they left the sheriff's office, the children clustering around them in the fading light. "He can't hurt you anymore." Sarah looked up at him, searching his face. "There's something I need to ask you," she said quietly, mindful of the children's attentive ears. "About the ranch. George said that it's mortgaged," Kieran finished for her. "It is or was." He smiled slightly. "The mining company was very grateful for my help in locating you, grateful enough to purchase another parcel of land adjoining their current operation, land that I happen to own." Sarah's eyes widened. "So the ranch is secure," Kieran assured her. "More than secure. We'll have to discuss what to do with the rest of the money, actually." The casual "we" sent warmth spreading through Sarah's chest. "We will," she agreed, taking his hand as they began the journey home, truly home now, in every sense of the word. The following Sunday found the Xavier Ranch transformed. Fresh pine boughs decorated the porch, and inside, the house gleamed with polish and care. In the kitchen, Charlotte and Emma helped Sarah arrange plates of food on the large table, while James and Kieran welcomed guests arriving for the celebration. Dr. and Mrs. Simmons were the first to arrive, followed by Sheriff Doyle and his wife, and gradually the house filled with neighbors and townspeople curious to witness the union of the quiet rancher and the widow who had arrived so mysteriously just 2 months earlier. Upstairs, Sarah smoothed the skirt of her new dress, a deep blue wool that Kieran had insisted on ordering from Denver, despite her protests that it was an extravagance. Her hair was arranged simply but elegantly, with sprigs of winter berries tucked into the twist at her nape. A soft knock at the door preceded Charlotte's entrance. "Mama, you look beautiful," she breathed, her eyes wide with admiration. "Thank you, darling," Sarah smiled, kneeling to straighten her daughter's ribbon. "Are you ready?" Charlotte nodded solemnly. "James says he's going to walk you down the stairs because Papa would want him to." Sarah's heart swelled with pride and a bittersweet ache. "Your father would be very proud of all of you," she said, "and I think he would approve of Mr. Xavier." "Kieran," Charlotte corrected. "He said we should call him Kieran now since he's going to be our new papa." "Did he?" Sarah asked, touched by the gesture she hadn't known about. Charlotte nodded again. "He asked us first if it was all right. James said yes right away. I said I would think about it." She looked down, suddenly shy. "I decided it's all right. Emma's already calling him Papa when he's not listening." Sarah pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. "I love you so much, Charlotte. You know that having Kieran in our lives doesn't change how much I loved your father, don't you?" "I know," Charlotte assured her. "Papa would want us to be happy, and Kieran makes you smile again." A knock at the door announced James, looking solemn and proud in his new suit, his father's hat held carefully in his hands. "It's time, Mama," he said. "Everyone's waiting." Sarah took her son's offered arm, Charlotte trailing behind them as they descended the stairs. In the main room, the furniture had been pushed back to create space for the gathering. Minister Wilson stood by the fireplace, and beside him, Kieran waited, his expression transforming from nervousness to awe as Sarah appeared. Emma, holding a small bouquet of winter greenery, broke protocol to run forward and take Sarah's free hand. "You look like a queen, Mama," she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, drawing affectionate laughter from the assembled guests. The ceremony was simple and brief, the traditional vows spoken with quiet certainty. When Minister Wilson pronounced them husband and wife, Kieran's kiss was gentle but filled with promise. mindful of their audience but leaving Sarah in no doubt of his feelings. The celebration continued into the evening, the house filled with more laughter and music than it had known in years. As the last guests departed, and the children were settled into their beds, James now in the room that had once belonged to Daniel, the girls still sharing the room that had first welcomed them on that stormy night, Sarah and Kieran found themselves alone on the porch, wrapped in a quilt against the winter chill. "Happy, Mrs. Xavier?" Kieran asked, his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close against his side. "More than I ever thought possible again," Sarah replied honestly. "Though I keep expecting to wake up and find myself back in that stable." Kieran chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly in his chest beneath her ear. "That was the luckiest night of my life," he said, "finding you there. You said you're home now," Sarah remembered. "I thought I'd misheard you." "I knew it the moment I saw you," Kieran admitted. "Something just clicked into place, like the ranch had been waiting for you all along." Sarah leaned up to kiss him softly. "Or perhaps we were waiting for each other." Behind them, the house stood warm and solid, sheltering their sleeping children. Before them stretched the valley, silver in the moonlight, and beyond that, the endless possibilities of their future together. Sarah hadn't believed in second chances before that night in the stable. Now, in Kieran's arms with their family safe and whole, she couldn't imagine a life without one. "We're home," she whispered against his lips. "All of us together." "Forever," Kieran promised, sealing the vow with a kiss that spoke of all the love and joy yet to come. Spring came early to Anima's Forks in 1872. The snow retreated up the mountainsides, revealing meadows that quickly transformed from brown to vibrant green. On the Xavier Ranch, new life appeared everywhere: calves in the pastures, chicks in the henhouse, and seedlings in the expanded garden where Sarah now worked with Charlotte, teaching her daughter the growing ways her own mother had taught her. The house had undergone a transformation as well. With the proceeds from the mining claim safely invested for the children's future, and the ranch's finances secured by the land sale, Sarah had gradually made the house truly theirs. New curtains brightened the windows. A proper piano stood in the sitting room where Emma took lessons from Mrs. Simmons twice a week, and bookshelves lined Kieran's study, filled with volumes for every member of the family. Most significant of all was the small room next to the main bedroom, which Sarah and James had secretly prepared during the final weeks of winter. Its walls were painted a soft yellow, with a hand-sewn quilt draped over the new cradle that Kieran had crafted without knowing its true purpose. On this particular morning in late April, Sarah stood in the doorway of that room, one hand resting on her still flat stomach, imagining how it would look when occupied. So absorbed was she in this vision that she didn't hear Kieran approach until his arms slipped around her waist from behind. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" he murmured against her hair. Sarah leaned back against his solid warmth. "About how this room won't be empty much longer," she replied, turning in his arms to see his reaction. Kieran's expression shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension. "Sarah," he breathed, his hands moving to cradle her face. "Are you saying in October?" she confirmed, her smile widening at the joy blooming across his features. "Dr. Simmons confirmed it yesterday when I went to town." Kieran lifted her off her feet in a careful embrace, his laughter mingling with hers. "A baby," he marveled, setting her down gently. "Our baby." "Is it too soon?" Sarah asked, a flutter of uncertainty breaking through her happiness. "The children will be overjoyed," Kieran assured her. "They've been dropping hints for months. I think Charlotte has been studying Dr. Simmons's medical books when we thought she was reading poetry." Sarah laughed. "That explains the questions she's been asking about babies." She grew serious again. "And you, Are you ready to be a father again? Kieran's eyes softened with understanding. I've been a father to James, Charlotte, and Emma since the day you all came into my life, he said. This baby will be another blessing in a house already full of them. He placed his hand gently over hers on her stomach. Daniel would have loved having brothers and sisters. Elizabeth, too, she always wanted a large family. The mention of his first wife and son no longer brought pain to either of them. Sarah had made space in her heart for the memory of Thomas, and Kieran had done the same for Elizabeth and Daniel. Their photographs stood side by side on the mantel, a reminder that love didn't diminish when shared, it only grew stronger. "Shall we tell the children now?" Sarah asked. Kieran nodded, taking her hand. "No time like the present." They found James in the stable, diligently brushing down his mare, a 10th birthday present from Kieran that the boy cherished above all his possessions. At nearly 10, James had grown taller and stronger, his serious nature now balanced by an increasing confidence. Charlotte was in the garden, making careful notes in the journal she kept of every plant's progress. At 8, she showed signs of becoming a natural healer, her interest in medicine encouraged by Dr. Simmons, who allowed her to observe his less serious cases when Sarah brought her to town. Emma, now 6, was in her favorite spot beneath the old oak tree where Kieran had built a swing the previous summer. She was singing to herself, a habit that filled the ranch with unexpected bursts of music at all hours. Kieran whistled sharply, the signal that brought all 3 children running. They gathered on the porch, faces curious as they noted the special light in their mother's eyes. "Your mother and I have news," Kieran began, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Are we getting a new horse?" James asked hopefully. "Better than that," Sarah smiled. "A new brother or sister." There was a moment of stunned silence before Emma squealed with delight. "A baby, like Mrs. Peterson's. Can I hold it?" "When is it coming?" "In October," Sarah replied, laughing at her youngest daughter's enthusiasm. Charlotte's eyes were wide with understanding. "That's why you've been tired in the mornings," she said with the air of a mystery solved. "Dr. Simmons says that's common in the early months." James was quieter, but the smile spreading across his face told Sarah all she needed to know about his feelings on the matter. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" he asked. "We won't know until it arrives," Kieran told him. "Either way, I'll need your help. A big brother has important responsibilities." James nodded solemnly. "I know, I'll teach him or her everything about the ranch, just like you taught me." As the children peppered them with questions and suggestions for names, Sarah caught Kieran's eye over Emma's head. The love she saw there mirrored her own, deep, abiding, and still tinged with wonder at how their broken pieces had come together to form something whole and beautiful. That night, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into peaceful quiet, Sarah and Kieran sat on their porch as they did most evenings, watching the stars emerge above the mountains. The tradition had begun that first night and continued through all seasons, a time for them to simply be together after the busy demands of ranch and family life. "I've been thinking," Kieran said, his fingers laced with hers on the arm of the bench they shared, "about expanding the house." "Oh." Sarah turned to study his profile in the fading light. "What did you have in mind?" "Another bedroom at least. Maybe 2. He smiled at her raised eyebrows. "For the future. And a proper schoolroom. The children shouldn't have to ride into town every day when the weather turns." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. "You're thinking ahead." "Someone has to," Kieran replied, his tone light but his meaning clear. He was planning for years to come for their family's growth, for their children's education, for a future they would build together. "I never expected this," Sarah confessed softly. "When Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over, that all I could hope for was survival for the children's sake, if not my own. Kieran's arm tightened around her. I felt the same after losing Elizabeth and Daniel. The ranch was just something to occupy my hands while time passed. He kissed her temple gently. Then you showed up in my stable with those 3 frightened children, and suddenly time mattered again. Sarah turned her face up to his. You saved us that night. No, Kieran corrected her. You saved each other. You gave me back my home, Sarah, made it more than just a place to exist. As their lips met in a kiss deepened by shared memories and promises kept, Sarah thought of how far they had come from that desperate night, from strangers offering and accepting temporary shelter, to a family bound by choice as much as circumstance. From a woman with nowhere to turn, and a man with nowhere to belong, to partners facing whatever came next together. The stable where they had first met still stood, visible from the porch where they now sat. But it was no longer a place of last resort, just another part of the ranch that had become truly home to all of them. I love you, Sarah whispered against Kieran's lips. Forever grateful that you found us that night. Best thing I ever did, Kieran replied, his voice rough with emotion. Telling you that you were home. And they were, all of them, home in the deepest sense of the word, where love had found them in their darkest hour and showed them the way back to light.